Hi, welcome back to Gronsky Books. Obviously, today we're doing something a little bit different. This is going to remain a books and reading channel, but I haven't really felt like doing a lot of reading lately. I've been kind of in a reading slump, and for the first time since I started this channel, I didn't get a video out this week. I just didn't feel like talking about books. So often what happens when I get into sort of these moody sort of slumps, I turn to music. If there's anything in this world that I like as much as reading, it's music. I get it. I'll make a list. Once and for all, I'll get it sorted out. I'm gonna figure out my top 10 albums of the 90s, and I may as well do the 80s and the 2000s and the 2010s while I'm at it. I've done that. I've made my top 10 lists of the last 4 decades. So here you can see it says the top 40 albums of the last 40 years. Before I give you this list, I want to say that my list is not going to look anything like your list. And that's what's fun about finding out what's on other people's lists, is that it doesn't look like our list. Each one of our lists is as unique as our own fingerprints. Right? So to help kind of illustrate that point, I conducted a quick poll of my friends and family. And here you can see I've got my top 5 classic albums. Since I'm giving you my top 10 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010 albums, I decided to go back before the 80s and just do a quick poll of my friends and family about what's your top 5 albums before 1980. And so here's mine. Again, my list is going to look different from your list, but there will be overlaps, right? And as you can see here, I pointed out Blonde on Blonde and Velvet Underground and Nico, because here you can see my friend Liz, she also picked Blonde on Blonde and Velvet Underground and Nico as her top 5 classic albums, along with a few others here that you can see. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, so I don't have time to go through everybody's picks one at a time and discuss them all. But you can pause the video and you can look at everything else that they've picked if you want. Okay. Now she also picked the Beatles' White Album, which Kathy also picked, and so did Sebi. Now Sebi also picked Led Zeppelin's first album, and Ariel also picked Led Zeppelin's first album. And Ariel picked Fleetwood Mac's Rumors as one of her top 5 albums. Elizabeth picked Fleetwood Mac's Rumors as one of her top 5 albums. And when I started seeing these duplicates come in as I'm polling my friends here, I started thinking like, this is crazy. These lists are all very unique, but the overlaps are intriguing to me. Now, Elizabeth also picked Holst's The Planets, which is something that I haven't thought of in probably 30 years. But Megan also picked The Planets as one of her top 5 albums, which blew my mind. Megan also picked Led Zeppelin's 3, and Phil picked Led Zeppelin's 3. Phil also picked Pink Floyd's Animals, and Kevin picked Led Zeppelin 3 and Pink Floyd's Animals on his list. There's 2 duplications there. Now, Kevin also picked Creedence Clearwater Revival's Green River, and so did Gail. And so Gail picked Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, as did my friend who wishes to remain anonymous. My friend also picked Pink Floyd The Wall, as did Bill. And Bill picked Dark Side of the Moon as well, as did Mike, Pink Floyd The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon. But Mike also picked Rush 2112 and Aerosmith's Toys in the Attic, 2 very random albums. But then my brother Ryan picked only 2 albums, and they happened to be Rush 2112 and Aerosmith Toys in the Attic. But Dell also picked Rush 2112, along with Jethro Tull's Aqualung. And Timo picked Jethro Tull's Aqualung. And now here the duplications start to break down a little bit. Timo picked Neil Diamond, The Feel of Neil Diamond. Nobody else picked this particular album, but my mom did pick 2 different Neil Diamond albums, Love at the Greek and Taproot Manuscript. Of note, she also picked Carole King's Tapestry, which is the 3rd time this album made somebody's top 5 in this poll. Alex here managed to pick 3 albums that nobody else has picked. My sister Caitlin picked just 1 album that was unique among all picks. And my father, who despite having picked 7 albums, managed not to pick anything that anybody else picked. And so you can see that everybody's lists are totally different. And that's what's fun about looking at other people's lists in music. right? We're all different. We all have our own tastes. We all come at music with our own perspectives. And our top 5 or our top 10 lists are all going to look different. So going forward, when you look at my top 10 lists that I'm about to show you, don't get mad at me if it doesn't match your list. Just tell me what would have made your list. I would love to know. All right, top 40 albums of the last 40 years. And we are going to start off with the top 10 albums of the 1980s. First up is Lou Reed's New York from 1989. And the first 3 tracks on this album, Romeo Had Juliet, Halloween Parade, and Dirty Boulevard, are some of the lyrically rawest songs that you're ever going to hear. I printed out some lyrics here from Dirty Boulevard. It says, he's got 9 brothers and sisters. They're brought up on their knees. It's hard to run when a coat hanger beats you on the thighs. Pedro dreams of being older and killing the old man, but that's a slim chance. He's going to the boulevard. All right, next up, we've got the Pixies' Surfer Rosa from 1988. I was talking to Peachy Peach about Kissy Kiss. If you only know one song by the Pixies, it's probably Where Is My Mind? And that's track number 7 on Surfer Rosa. But I would recommend you go check out Gigantic, sung by Kim Deal, also on this album. All right, next up is The Smiths' The Queen Is Dead from 1986. This is by far my favorite Smiths album. I Know It's Over is on this album. Is one of my favorite songs of all time. Actually, the first time I ever heard I Know It's Over was a cover version by the Trash Can Sinatras. I didn't even know it was a Smiths song at the time. And then I heard the Smiths version and it kind of blew my mind. All right, next up we've got the Jesus and Mary Chain Automatic from 1989. The standout tracks on this album would be Here Comes Alice and Head On. The Jesus and Mary Chain really took everything that I loved about Iggy Pop and Billy Idol and made it good. And they invented the shoegaze genre of rock and roll, and they really paved the way for bands like My Bloody Valentine and Smashing Pumpkins in the end. Okay, next we got Tom Waits' Rain Dogs from 1985. Now, can you handle 55 minutes of disjointed guitars and xylophones, Tropicana drum beats, and growled poetry? I hope so, because that's what you're going to get with Rain Dogs. If you can only handle 3 minutes of that, I suggest you check out the song Clap Hands. All right, next up we've got U2's The Joshua Tree from 1987, probably the most accessible, straightforward rock and roll album, most popular album on the list for sure. And talk about opening tracks. This is Where the Streets Have No Name, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, and With or Without You. Those are like 3 of the most popular songs from the 80s, period. And they're the 3 opening tracks to one album. If those were 3 tracks on a greatest hits album, that album would sell. You know what I mean? Like this is U2 at the height of their powers. All right, now we've got the Pixies' Doolittle from 1989. If you've never heard the Pixies before, I would suggest checking out the song Debaser off this album. But if you already know the Pixies a little bit and you want to go deeper, check out Hey or Gouge Away, or just listen to this album 100 times and commit it to memory, quote it to all your friends, and compare everything else that you listen to this album forever and ever. Like everybody else did. All right, 9 Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine from 1989. I want to say Trent Reznor single-handedly invented the industrial genre when he busted onto the scene with this album, but he really owes a debt to bands like Ministry, who were paving the way into industrial all through the 80s. But when Head Like a Hole hit MTV, Trent Reznor filled a niche that only he could fill. All right, and in the number 2 spot, we've got REM's Murmur from 1983. And I just want to point out that REM is higher on this list than the Smiths. But there's 2 types of music fans in this world: REM fans and Smiths fans. I am an REM fan. And actually, when I started this, I did a top 20 list of the 80s. And there were 3 other REM albums that showed up in, 11 through 20. So we're going to see more REM in the 90s. Okay. Moving on to number 1, we've got New Order's Substance, released in 1987. And I know this is kind of cheating because it's a singles compilation, but here's the thing. When I was about 13 years old, I had a paper route, and I listened to that cassette tape over and over and over again. And so for 3 years, I listened to this album. And to this day, whenever I listen to this album, I can see a little map of the quadrant of my hometown where my paper route was. I can see which houses I was supposed to be delivering newspapers to as I go through the sequence of the tracks on this album. It's kind of a weird story to tell, I guess. There are a small handful of albums that I know like the back of my hand, and I'll get to some of those others later, but this is definitely one of them. So anyway, there we go. That is my top 10 albums of the 1980s. All right, now we come to the 1990s, which is the heart and soul of when I discovered music for myself. And starting off at number 10 is Built to Spill from 1999. This is a band with some great rock and roll guitar sensibilities that you haven't heard a million times over and over and over again. If you want to check out the song Else, E-L-S-E, that would be a great introduction to this band. All right, next up we've got Elliott Smith's XO from 1998. This album features Tomorrow Tomorrow and Waltz Number 2, which are some indispensable songs if you ask me. This whole album really conveys a kind of sadness. All of his albums really do, but especially his earlier ones. It's beautiful. It's really so beautiful. It's a gorgeous outpouring of emotion. All right, at number 8, we've got Neil Young's Harvest Moon from 1992. And I think this is Neil Young's probably last truly magnificent album. I counted them when I was making this up. I've got 16 studio albums by Neil Young that were recorded after Harvest Moon in 1992. And none of them capture the song-by-song quality that is on this album. Every track on Harvest Moon is pure gold. And coming in at number 7 is Counting Crows, August and Everything After from 1993. And it's kind of a shame that this album couldn't go higher, because for the style that this music was going for, this really is a perfect album. Everybody knows Mr. Jones, but songs like Anna Begins and Raining in Baltimore and A Murder of One, these are all just, the whole album is so good. All right, in number 6, we've got Throwing Copper by Live. This is the album that started this whole thing. Anyway, the first 3 Live albums, I think, are their best. Throwing Copper is their second. And for my money, it doesn't get any better than Pillar of Davidson. That would be the song of theirs that I would recommend to anybody. It might not be the most accessible. Songs like I Alone and Lightning Crashes were the popular songs on the radio, and All Over You is a really great song. I don't know if that one was ever on the radio, but that one's really good too. But Pillar of Davidson is my very favorite live song. All right, so moving on to number 5, we've got Beck's Mutations from 1998, and this is another one of those albums that I know like the back of my hand. And there's a reason for that. In the year 2000, I bought a Saturn SL1 in Anchorage, Alaska, and I named it the Disco House. And I had one CD, and I played that one CD for over a year, everywhere that I went. Everybody listened to Beck's Mutations with me, whether they liked it or not. All right, so moving on. We've got Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by the Smashing Pumpkins, 1995. Now, this album is 28 songs, is a double album, and it runs the gamut of their styles. Everything from the sort of melodic Tonight Tonight to the harder rocking Zero and Bullet with Butterfly Wings, up into the more sonic, like hardest rocking stuff that you can do and still be popular. The XYU on the second album. This album really does it all and kind of hits all those notes. I think the song with probably the most enduring popularity, though, turns out to be 1979, which wasn't the most popular song in the 90s. I think Bullet with Butterfly Wings was the most popular song in the 90s, but 1979 has stood the test of time. That song has kind of become an anthem for my generation. And I was born in 1979, so I'm one of those people. All right, next up we've got OK Computer by Radiohead from 1997. And I had this really long story that I was going to tell you about trading CDs in the hall of high school and how I was introduced to Radiohead and all that. But I'm not going to tell it because this video is already getting to be longer than I wanted it to be. So I think most of us are pretty familiar with this album, so I'm just going to move on. All right, so then we've got Neutral Milk Hotels in the Aeroplane Over the Sea, and you guys are probably rolling your eyes at me that this is too obvious of a pick, but hey, I am obviously not trying to break the mold here. I've got OK Computer and Smashing Pumpkins on this list already, so I'm just picking what I love. Now this album was especially important to me because when I first heard of it in 2002 or 2003, I had just gotten my first guitar. Now, if you've listened to this album, you'll know that it's really acoustic guitar heavy. And Jeff Mangum plays a lot of chords that I can play. It's not real complicated. They're basically campfire chords played really hard. It's not melodic and kumbaya, that's for sure. But it was weird and kind of easy to play, and so I learned how to play these songs, and then I was able to write my own songs, and I ended up writing about 3 albums worth of my own music, and it was all inspired by Neutral Milk Hotel. This album and On Avery Island and Everything Is and all the other stuff that I was able to find online at the time. So this album will always have a special place in my heart, and right now it's got a very special place in my top 10 at number 2. All right, and then number 1, you guessed it, it's REM, Automatic for the People. This was the first album that I ever owned. And this album, I think we all have an album like this for us. This is the album that really taught me what music could be. This might not technically be the best rock album of all time or anything, but it's my favorite album of all time because it was so transformative to the way that I perceived music at all. You know what I mean? Like everything that I listened to up until my discovery of this album was like church hymns and Irish folk music and maybe the golden oldies if I was lucky. You know, my only other introduction to rock music was like the Transformers theme song or the Ninja Turtles theme song on TV. You know, the coolest music that I listened to was like watching Knight Rider or something on television. And TV shows, the theme songs and soundtracks for television shows were the only music that I ever really listened to. So when I branched out and started listening to music on my own, Automatic for the People was the first album that really hit me as something worth listening to. And it has stuck with me ever since. Okay, so this is something special. This is just something real quick here. Just this morning, actually, I just put this together. So just this morning, a friend of mine sent me this. This is a band alignment chart. On the left side, you have happy. On the right side, you have sad. On the top, you have angry bands, and on the bottom, you have the horny bands. And then you've got kind of a circle in the middle, and that's called the sarcasm belt. And so you've got bands that are situated throughout this belt, and as you slide further toward one or the other, you know, that's where they fit on the graph, right? You know, you've got No Doubt past the sarcasm belt on the happy side, and you've got Radiohead right on the sarcasm belt on the sad side. Okay, and this is kind of a clever little list, but there are a number of things here that I disagreed with, because you've got Nine Inch Nails down here in the sad, horny corner, but that discounts the fact, I mean, they're so far away from the angry side. They're more of an angry, horny band than a sad, horny band. You know what I mean? So I made some improvements to this. And so this is what I spent my morning doing today. I came up with this list, and I'm not going to go through all this in detail, but I've got an angry to happy left to right, and then I've got an ironic to literal gradient from top to bottom, and then I've got the horny horizon around the middle there. All bands, no matter what their mood, can be horny. So the further out you go, the hornier they are. So you can take a look at this for yourself if you want to. I'm just going to move on now. All right, and now we are up to the top 10 albums of the 2000s, and we are going to start off with Bon Iver's For Emma Forever Ago from 2008. And if you don't know the legendary story about how Justin Vernon went off into a cabin in the woods for I don't know how long out in Wisconsin to write this album in complete isolation. And he came out basically with a complete album full of some of the most emotional songs you will ever hear. It is worth looking that up. All right, next in the number 9 spot, we've got Arcade Fire's Funeral from 2004. I was at a diner in Anchorage when I first heard of Arcade Fire. Conan O'Brien was on a TV in the corner playing, and Arcade Fire came on as the musical guest, and they played Neighborhood Number 2, and I'd never heard it before. And you know, there's band members with motocross helmets and they're playing drumsticks on each other's heads, and someone's got an accordion. It was so much different than anything else that I'd ever seen, and I couldn't hear who Conan O'Brien said they were at the end of the performance. So I went home, and this is in the very early days of being able to go online and Google something that you just saw on TV. It took me 3 days to figure out who the guest was on Conan O'Brien that night. But I finally found it, and it was Arcade Fire, and I went down to my local record store. They didn't have it in stock, so they had to special order it for me, and 10 days later it came in, and I have been a fan of the band ever since. And then in the number 8 slot is the Notwist's Neon Golden from 2002. Now this album's over 20 years old, and when you listen to it, it's got all these little sounds that sound like they're played with real instruments, like it's real instrumentation, but on the other hand, it sounds like it's been programmed somehow, like it's almost electronic music, but electronic music made out of real instruments. And the sound just blew my mind, and for an album that's over 20 years old, I'd be really curious to know about the production of this album. It seems like it was way ahead of its time, and it's really good. It's not just technically interesting, it's also a really good album. And speaking of technically interesting, number 7's In Rainbows by Radiohead. This is probably the best arranged album that I have ever heard in my life. It is so technically proficient. I don't know, it's hard to explain without being able to play you examples. And I resent YouTube for not allowing me to just play snippets of these songs for you guys. But I encourage you, if you haven't heard In Rainbows, go check out some of the songs. I don't even care which one. Just pick at random. Each one is a superb example of superior arrangement in music. All right, coming up next in the number 6 slot is Bright Eyes, I'm Wide Awake, It's Morning. This album was released the year I discovered Bright Eyes, in 2005. And this specific album has so many songs that are meaningful to me and memories that I share with friends that go as deep as music and memory can coexist together. And it's so deeply personal that I don't think I'm gonna share anymore about that. All right, next up is The National's Boxer from 2007. This was also the first album by The National that I ever heard. And I actually saw them this year in 2007 at Coachella. And I'll never forget that we were standing behind this super fan at the concert who had a National tattoo about that big on his neck or across his shoulders or something. And he was just, you know, way into the show, shirt off, really getting down. And that was my introduction to The National. I thought, it's like, if The National can inspire fans like this, they must be onto something. I've yet to get my National tattoo, but I'm like this close. All right, so then next up is Animal Collective's Feels from 2005. I could probably just listen to this album any old time, which is strange because this is a pretty weird album. Next is Sunset Rubdown, Random Spirit Lover. And if an album can be weirder than Animal Collective's Feels, it's Sunset Rubdown's Random Spirit Lover. This album is so lyrically wild. I printed out some lyrics to this one too, and I'll just let them speak for themselves. 'Cause you're the one who's riding around on a leopard, and you're the one who's throwing dead birds in the air. And you're the one whose wild hide will weather in the weathering days to a lover made soft so princes can lay down their princely white heads of hair. If that doesn't sound like rock and roll, I don't know what does. All right, next we've got My Morning Jacket at Dawn, and this album does it all. Jeebus, what an album. This captures all of the emotions. It starts off with the title track At Dawn, which is like this, it's got this rumbling, long, slow intro, which turns into this slow beat, and then these plaintive vocals come in. And then it kind of goes into these folk rock songs, and then it gets kind of longing but optimistic with the way that he sings. And then we move into this rowdy romp of a song called Honest Man. And then we move from the rowdy song into this extremely downbeat but extraordinarily beautiful I Needed It Most. I mean, this album just has all these highs and lows, these peaks and valleys. And when you listen to it in its entirety, it just takes you through all these movements. Just wonderful how it just carries you through so seamlessly through all of these emotions. And then moving on to number 1 is The Moon and Antarctica by Modest Mouse. And this album actually came out in 2000, kicking off the decade. My friend actually introduced me to this band. He illegally downloaded a bunch of songs onto my Gateway 2000 desktop computer, songs like Styrofoam Boots and Bankrupt on Selling, and so those were the first songs of theirs that I ever heard. And so when The Moon and Antarctica came out, I bought it. And so The Moon and Antarctica was my first full-length Modest Mouse album that I ever heard. I was completely hooked. Man, this is another one of those albums that I know like the back of my hand. I can sing along to every song on this album. I just know it way too well. All right, so now we're looking at the top 10 albums of the 2010s. Getting to the last list. All right, and first up in the number 10 slot is Strand of Oaks and their album Heal. In 2014, when this album came out, I'd slipped a disc between my L4 and L5 vertebrae, and I was laid up in bed for a number of weeks. And I listened to this album as I was convalescing. And so I associate the album Heal with a great deal of pain and misery. I was just in sheer misery all the time, taking care of myself, and it was just horrible. But the Strand of Oaks album, which I listened to almost exclusively during that period, and now has that association with it forever and ever, is a wonderful album, but I can't listen to it without remembering my convalescent period. All right, next up in the number 9 slot, we've got Perfume Genius's album No Shape from 2017. Perfume Genius releases authentic music. I'm sure a lot of bands do, but their music feels so real to me. And this particular album also has the added benefit of being really musically diverse and compelling. So I love this album, and I would recommend that if you don't know them, to check out the song Slip Away. In the number 8 slot, we've got Moby's album Innocence from 2013. Now, that year in 2013, I was at a Thanksgiving house party out in the country in the woods with a bunch of friends, and it was a kind of boozy Thanksgiving party. We had a bonfire. A friend of mine told me about this album that had just come out, and that Wayne Cohn had a song on it, and Damian Gerardo and a few other guest artists were on there, and that the album was really good. And after everybody went to bed, I stayed up later and listened to it. In a house full of people sleeping off their drunk, I listened to this Moby album, and so now I've got that memory associated with this album forever. I don't know, do you guys, I'm telling a lot of these stories about like how I associate music with certain memories, and do you guys do that too? Do you associate certain albums with times in your life and memories, and like you guys make those connections? To me, like, music is inseparable from my life, and so that's why I like music so much. It's almost like reading my own diary. Sometimes when I listen to music, I'm reminded of so much of my own life when I listen to music. All right, then number 7, we've got Phoebe Bridgers. Now, Stranger in the Alps came out in 2017, but I didn't learn about this album until 2020 when her album Punisher came out. And so I bought Punisher and Stranger in the Alps at the same time. And I completely stopped listening to music. And I started listening to Phoebe Bridgers. for a long time. I only listened to those two albums. I just listened to them over and over and over. Punisher came out in 2020, so that's not in this decade. But I listened to these two albums over and over and over. There's just something about her style that really got to me. I really like it. All right. Also in 2017, Gorillaz Humans album came out, and when I first heard this album, I hated it. This is a textbook example of why album sequencing is so important. But the thing is, like, I know that I like Gorillaz, so I gave it another chance and I started listening to the songs individually, and I started picking out a few that I liked, and I started making a playlist of my own songs. And I ended up coming up with my own version of this album, a select 14 tracks off of this album in a particular order that I think this album should have been released in. I'm just going to put that on the screen here. And this is the ideal way to listen to Humans. This is how I listen to it. I've got a playlist on my computer set up so I can listen to this album just like this. All right, coming up in the number 5 slot is The National's High Violet. And I'll just say about this album that you should listen to Afraid of Everyone and Conversation 16 and probably Terrible Love. Go listen to those 3 songs. If you're not sold on this album, you're lost. All right, coming up in the number 4 slot, we've got Aesop Rock's The Impossible Kid from 2016. Aesop Rock is a lyrical genius. He's a bona fide genius. Check out the song Rings, exploration about his artistic regrets in life. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. All right, number 3 is Lana Del Rey's Born to Die. You can say whatever you want to say about me. I love Lana Del Rey. I don't even care. She's released 9 albums in like the last 11 years or something, which is like an incredible output. Now, not all of those 11 albums are as good as Born to Die, but you know, you can't put lightning back in the bottle. You know what I mean? Okay, number 2, we've got Aurora, All My Demons Greeting Me as a Friend. And this is another one of those albums that I listened to over and over and over again. When I started listening to this album, I dropped everything else and I just listened to this one basically exclusively. I don't know what it is, but I've listened to this album many hundreds of times. And all of her other albums too. And then in the number 1 slot, and this isn't really any kind of question at all, it wasn't even a competition whatsoever, is Moon-Shaped Pool by Radiohead. This is their last full-length studio release. This came out in 2016. And if they never release anything else again, they went out on a really high note. This album is absolutely superb. It's 11 tracks, but I added 2 others to my version of this album. These are My Twisted Words and Spectre. Spectre was a song that they recorded for the James Bond as a James Bond theme, but it was rejected because it was too dark. Well, I loved it and I threw it into this album. I think it fits really well with this album. All right, well, that's basically it for me. This video turned out to be quite a bit longer than I was expecting it to be. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you stuck around to the end, I would love to hear what your top picks for the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. What were your top classic albums? I don't know, whatever you want to tell me. Put it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. I love talking about music. I'll try to interact with everybody that I can. Anyway, that's about going to do it for me. The next time you see me, I will be talking books again. So we'll see you in the next one.